Hello. Well, it's the third day, so I can understand. We've been having a very interesting, important discussion on renewing the Commonwealth. In an era where we are dealing with major injustices, where we need to look at issues related to inclusiveness, and today, we are focusing on accountability. We say a lot that we do talk shops, we talk a lot. We need to move to action. But then if we have to move to action, we need to have who we should hold responsible, why we should hold them responsible, for what we should hold them responsible, and how we should hold them responsible. And a lot of the time when we talk about accountability, issues related to development, we are pointing the finger at government at different levels. However, there are other players in development, very important players who have huge influence over how the development trajectory goes, in which direction it goes. And this panel is looking at some of these other players. We are going to look at the multilaterals, bilaterals. We are looking at the international NGOs, and we are looking at civil society and discussing accountability in development. What our role is, what our responsibility is, and what we should be doing to address the challenges. And I have an amazing panel here that is going to deal with this issue. And when I tell you who they are, you would understand why they are the best people to be speaking about this. Let me first introduce Saba Hachem. Saba is a senior advisor in the Secretariat of the Multilateral Organization Performance Assessment Network. It's a network of donor countries conducting joint assessments of the performance of multilateral development organizations that they fund. And prior to this, he worked for the Independent Development Evaluation of the African Development Bank Group, and he was the manager in charge of evaluation of institutional processes and reforms of country strategies and programs. Next to Saba, we have Saba Al Mubaslat. I'm sorry, and I actually asked her how to pronounce her name. Saba Al Mubaslat. Saba is the CEO of the Humanitarian Leadership Academy. She joined the Humanitarian Leadership Academy as the first CEO in September 2015 after 22 years of frontline response to humanitarian crisis. Before the Academy, Saba was the country director for Save the Children International in Jordan, working in the on the Syria response for several years, and she was responsible for the overall direction, leadership, and coordination of Save the Children's programs in Jordan for both development and humanitarian response. And last but not the least, Emele Duituturaga. She is the executive director of the Pacific Islands Association of Non-Governmental Organizations, and she has been the executive director since 2009. She has worked as a development specialist for over 2 decades and is a strong advocate for strengthening civil society engagement and partnerships. She has been instrumental in Piango's positioning as a regional and global civil society development actor. And Piango, for those who do not know, is a regional umbrella body for NGOs with presence in all the 24 Pacific Island countries and territories. So you understand why I say this is the team that should be leading us in this discussion. And they would start by giving us their general impressions from the different sectors that you work in. Of what we are actually facing when we talk about accountability in development. What is the status quo? Where are we now? What is happening? What are the issues we need to be addressing? And what are some of the measures that have been put in place? So I would start with you. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, it's a real privilege to be sitting here. Well, I have to start with a disclaimer, because I have to say that I'm Mediterranean and my native language is French, so I'm naturally among the people who usually talk too much. But actually, since I'm forced to speak in English, I hope I will stay focused, but just for you to tell me to stop whenever
Sure.
you need to tell me to stop. So I think the initial questions and actually so when we talk about accountability, so what are the issues we are talking about? What are the questions and what is it that we are talking about in terms of processes in place? Well, I think given the general topic, there is a natural issue that comes to mind, which is inclusiveness. But let me not talk about this one because I'm assuming my fellow panelists will take that one and probably focus on my angle, which is more the multilateral side or the development cooperations. Well, I think I would mention two key issues, at least from my own experience. I think there is one issue which is an issue of alignment, consistency. We live in a world, and actually the development world is a world of complex web of relationships with multiple actors, with a lot of people trying to go in the same direction, but not having necessarily the same types of interests. And actually, if you think of development as a change process, normally the enemy of change is inconsistency. You do things that go in different directions and then you undermine what you are trying to do. And I think I'm linking that to accountability because actually accountability processes are tools that are used by certain actors to push in certain directions that correspond to their interests. So for example, accountability of multilaterals to donors is a reflection of some political interest of the donors to go in certain directions. But that combination of different directions, I think, can create an issue in terms of development. So that's one. The second one I would mention, which is probably more something that relates to my experience in evaluation, is really, at the end of the day, what we all want is things to move, things to improve. So it's not about kind of saying accountability as a stick. You haven't done things well and you are responsible. The idea is really to say, okay, so we are reporting, people should be held responsible, but for a purpose, and the overall purpose is changing lives in development. And I think finding, and that's again speaking about my own experience in evaluation, finding that right balance between, as we say, accountability and learning from these type of functions is quite interesting. It can be a challenge. In terms of what are the things that are in place already to tackle these issues? Well, I think I represent here an entity that is actually an accountability tool. So MOPAN is a network of 18 donors which is assessing the performance of multilateral organizations and for really the purpose of reporting back to citizens, to parliaments about how is their money used. So that's one of example of processes that is tackling accountability. I would say, and that's also the second area of my experience, there are internal accountability tools within the development agency. So independent evaluation is an accountability tool. And these exist and got strengthened over the years in the world of development to hold the institutions accountable. There have been global processes, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the aid effectiveness Paris Declaration, so all the processes that started Paris, Accra, Busan, tending to create partnerships and introducing this interesting idea that I think got lost somehow since then of mutual accountability between countries and development agencies. And as part of that, I would point, and that will be the last point I would mention, as part of Busan and in that process, I think they work very focused initiatives on transparency. One of them is the International Aid Transparency Initiative, if you've heard of it, which is basically making sure, at least pushing development institutions to report transparently on what they are doing so that we can enable external actors to hold them accountable. And I think that side of enabling the demand for accountability is very important. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much. Saba.
Thank you. Yeah, another disclaimer from my side. I'm a refugee myself. And I have a Jordanian nationality, so by default, Jordan becomes home. And now I'm trying to become a Londoner. So it's quite a mix. For 24 years, I worked in conflict areas, being deployed as part of an international team to either assess a situation or assist people as they move from one place to another. And my last mission was Syria. And I struggle with accountability. I don't know who's holding who accountable. I was in Davos earlier this year and then went to Riyadh to discuss accountability to the Yemeni population, and then found myself in Dubai talking about accountability again, and here we are. The discussion have not changed for the past decade, but we're becoming more aware that accountability does not end with a report that we submit to the donor. And I think because of the level of awareness that's being felt and gained and taken by civil societies, we are now under a lot more pressure to hold ourselves accountable to the affected populations. And when I say affected populations, I do not necessarily mean the refugees and the asylum seekers, but the usual citizen in your neighborhood, because that is an affected person by the decisions you make, whether you are a mayor or a governor or an MP or what have you. So what's happening now is a shift in the paradigm of how we are forced, not wanting to, define accountability. Now, talking about NGOs, you all must have been following the news, you know, scandal after another. The Charity Commission is questioning whether international organizations, or at least UK-based international organizations, do add value. Why are we giving this much money to aid? We're being questioned. And just because we're being questioned, now we are under a lot of pressure to become more transparent. I wish that that decision of being transparent was driven by our genuine sense of accountability to the affected populations that we work with. So that's one. Second, if you are a refugee, if you are a Syrian mother who crossed from the south of Syria, where you've lost everything, to a refugee camp in the middle of the desert and was told this is your new home, God knows for how long, you do not necessarily have the power to hold those in power accountable. What you do is that you say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. And I've seen that. I was among those who literally established the Za'atari camp at the border with Syria from scratch. And when you tell them, you know, this is what we have for you, a parcel of food with some variety of food, is that what you need? They say yes. Because they do know that, unfortunately, they do not have an opinion. We decided their needs for them. We shape the programs for them, and we follow our international standards that do not take into consideration that these people do not eat sardines. That's not part of their diet. So if they give them a can of sardine, they will sell it, cash it, and buy what they need. You cannot assume that people can hold you or take you to task or hold you accountable simply because they happen to have a voice. There has to be channels that are so independent that allow them to have a voice, be vocal, take you to task, assess your performance without being directly affected by your decision to cut them off or punish them, because we tend to do that. We've been demanding from almost every donor to establish an independent complaint mechanism where the affected person does not complain to the organization giving them aid, but to an independent body. I hope that the scandals that are happening in the sector right now would force the donors to think together, coordinate better, and invest in genuine empowerment for the affected population. My last comment. As NGOs, it's about time for us to realize that, you know, we're not cowboys. And even if it's an emergency, we should hold ourselves responsible to how we spend taxpayers' money and what we offer in terms of services. And we genuinely need to question whether our presence is the only way to provide services. I've been referred to as local for 15 years, and then I worked for international organizations, so suddenly I became, you know, the success story of an international organization where she takes a local Muslim Arab woman and make her the country director of an international organization. And here now I'm in London talking about those, the locals, but I'm still that local. And I tell you for a fact, local communities, no matter what they go through, they do survive. They're resilient. Look at all examples around the world. Which local community came to an end, never stood up again, and rebuilt itself because of a tough time it went through? With that, I hand over to civil society because I wish they can put more pressure on us, take us to task and say, you're needed in that particular way, and not for you to design your programs in London, Geneva, or New York and come and impose them on us. Because that's where we shift our role from being the implementing partners to becoming, hopefully, the enabling or the support arm as and when needed. And with that, maybe I think it's
Thank you. That's a good segue into looking at civil society, but looking at it differently. I mean, civil society, we are good at holding people to account, holding institutions to account. What about ourselves? And that's where I'd like you to speak to this issue of civil society accountability.
Well, Nana, just like we're asking what is the relevance and I guess legitimacy of the Commonwealth, it's like a boomerang question. It comes back to us. Recently, I was reading the website of Accountability Now, and I like what they said. Accountability is not a report, but a dynamic relationship with stakeholders and constituencies to improve our agency and our credibility. And of course, in the last decade, and certainly I talk about what we do in our region, in the Pacific Islands region, we keep getting referred to by the United Nations as small island developing states. Well, we've come up with a new title. We're big ocean states, yeah? We're the largest ocean in the world, so, small things don't come from our region, big things do. And one of those big things is that we in civil society have come to realize that, we've been taking governments on. We've been pointing fingers at governments. And as we've become influential, we've actually become professional lobbyists. We've now got the power of influence. The churches and other civil society organizations do provide essential services, education, churches for that matter. And with this newfound sort of power and influence, we've kind of had governments and others turn on us. Okay, you hold us accountable. What about your accountability? And certainly those of us who've hustled, on the world stage in terms of Busan and the UN and constantly promoting space for civil society, we've been given, okay, we recognize you, but we have a problem with your accountability. So, what this says to us is that in order to be credible, in order to continue to be influential, we really have to look at our own accountability. So what have we done in this area? Well, as far back as 92, Piango, our organization, and Commonwealth Foundation, One World Trust, came up with this toolkit, which looked at this issue. We've had the Open Government Initiative. There's been the Istanbul Principles and again, the toolkit. But I think that's specifically it. There've been documents, there've been charters, there've been, the talk, and we haven't gone that far. Now, what have we done about it in the Pacific? We've come up with our own brand of what we've called an accountability charter. We've decided as a coalition, because we are an umbrella organization, and so maybe for umbrella type organization, we're not just concerned about individual organization performances, but we're concerned about the sector. Because what we've seen donors do, and the Pacific, we talk about the Pacific paradox. We are the region in the world that receives the largest number of aid per capita. Why is it that with all that money coming through, things don't seem to get better? Now, at one point, we were starting to think maybe we're also part of the problem because we survive and exist on donor funding. So what we've also had to do is really look at, are we not just pushing those donor agendas that we complain about? So what we've realized is that, accountability is first and foremost for us because we're a membership organization. It's about accountability to our constituencies. Mm-hmm. It's accountability for what we say we do. Do we really represent those voices? Or are we constantly going to international forum, liking the sound of our voices and pushing those issues? Have those communities, how do we measure that those communities have gained power themselves, because it's about democratic participation. So it's very important that we hold ourselves accountable. So what we've done is come up with what we've called a code of minimum standards, because we've looked at what has happened elsewhere. But in our Pacific, we don't have a lot of that capacity. We don't have a lot of those resources. So the idea is, what are those standards? How do we demonstrate? What do we hold ourselves measurable on? So we come up with this code of minimum standards, and instead of responding like we constantly do to what the Globe, what Washington, what London, what everybody else tells us to do, we've actually gone to our members and say, what does accountability mean in your community? Because for centuries, we've always had traditional governance, So accountability mechanisms have existed. But in this 21st century, with partnerships with government and using public funds, it has brought about a different regime. So the idea is that we come up with what that means in a local context. And then what we're looking at is coming up with a regional framework, and we're trying to link that with the most recent initiative on the global standards of accountability that the big NGOs have done. There are gaps, but I'll come back to that later. But I think context is everything, and the practice of it is where we need to move to. So we need to move away from these declarations and charters and actually demonstrate what is it, which is why we're saying, let's get to the standard. Yeah. So how do I manage? I'm an executive director. Is my behavior linked in? And I think the important thing as well is because what makes civil society different is that we're value-driven. We're value-driven. So I think it's important to articulate what are those values and how are we holding ourselves accountable.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those points. And like you're saying, we are going to talk now about what the gaps are, because we want to be specific in this discussion. And the multilaterals, we've talked about the Busan Partnership Agreements, shared responsibility, looking at transparency when it comes to development aid and assistance and all of that. But as you rightly pointed out, there are challenges. So where is the gap? What's the problem? Why is it not working?
Wow. If I had a response to that, then I would have tried to do something. I think I would still relate that to my initial point. I think things go through, and because of misalignment and the fact that actors do not push in the same direction. For me, that's where there is a main gap. So in a way, you have global processes that indeed produce strategies, produce reports, and then implementation usually starts, and then the momentum gets lost. Well, let me take my experience of the African Development Bank as a very concrete example. You have a situation, so you have a regional development bank in a continent in which the needs are huge. So first of all, you have a kind of set of priorities to define where are you going in terms of addressing these needs. Well, when you are in that process, indeed, then you have shareholders, you have donors, and then you have different agendas coming and saying, okay, my interest is invest in health, and that's the condition to put money in the African Development Fund. On the other hand, you have a very clear deficit in infrastructure, and the mission of the bank is usually making roads, building power plants so that you have power. And at the end, you have this combination of very kind of agendas that are not necessarily aligned, in which you push different things and you get pushed in different directions, without necessarily failing your accountability relationship. And that's, I think, the interesting point of all that. Accountability is, I think, one of the issues is that it's a kind of piecemeal approach to accountability. So I report to that specific donor because I have done these kind of things, and I have done it. And then I report to someone else because I have done something else, and I have done it. But at the end, what is lost is the vision that is the person, the country, the local person, the person that you are trying to help, in which basically you come and you have done many different things, but the life has not changed. And I think that's where the link is broken, is basically because of this extremely wide web of accountability relationships. At the end, you lose the final, the most important one, which is accountability to people. But then the problem of accountability to people is who's going to enforce that?
And we'll come to that.
Yeah, okay.
So I'd like you to speak to that, because I think actually you find the same problem.
Yeah.
Accountability to donors.
It's exactly the same problem. And I think, from where you sit as a, an executive director or country director, you receive money from X number of donors, and each donor have their own definition of accountability, and then you work with a number of different communities at the local level, and each of them have their own understanding of how your action should be seen as accountable to them. And then you have the local authority in the presence of local authority. Unfortunately, sometimes in most of the contexts that we work in, there's absence of local authority. And the assumption that there's civil society in every place we are, well, it's not the case. There are so many places around the world. I just came back from Yemen. I can't say that there's civil society in Yemen. There are civil attempts, but there's not a cohesive fabric of civil society there. So when your loyalty is to those who are giving you the money to operate, then whether you like it or not, you're not impartial. Mm-hmm. You are being politicized, even if in a soft way. And I think until we readjust the moral compass to continue to point at the right direction, which is the big question of why are we here? What can we do to support people and then become obsolete? Why are we still in business 30 years in certain countries as international organizations? Until we answer those questions, we'll continue to repeat ourselves. My last point is really about the drastic changes and shifts in politics. Mm-hmm. From wanting to being very globalist in our approach to becoming very nationalistic in our approach. And then the likes of us really sort of like, where do we go? Pre-Brexit, pro-Brexit, post-Brexit, pre-Trump, post-Trump, where do we stand? So just redefining who we're accountable for and remembering that whatever we do has to have the human being that we work for and with at the center may help us get to a place where we better define accountability.
Thank you.
Yes, I think there is a tension between accountability or accounting for the resources that we use to those who provide that, which is traditionally donors, and accountability to the people that we're responsible. If we are about representation, if we say we're advocates and we represent people, that there is that tension. But I think one of the big gaps is enabling environment. I mean, the reality is there is shrinking space. Civil society organizations are being shut down. Human rights defenders are being shot. So, there is this tension between us having to be accountable and us being taken out because the very reason and purpose we exist. So there is that tension. And I want to link this to, so how do we frame this? And I want to propose that, because one of the difficulties we have experienced is what do we use, or how do we frame our need to be accountable, and how do we get governments to recognize and support that? And I'd like to suggest, and I borrowed this from someone in New York recently or last year, who suggested that, maybe we can turn the SDGs into a new social contract between governments and her people, because it's the one frame that governments and others do. And interestingly, when we started to look at what would a monitoring or accountability frame look like, we realized that there's a lot of gaps between the relationship between civil society and governments. Mm-hmm. So again, there's another tension there. If you're wanting to get recognition from donors and from governments, there is something to be worked on in terms of that relationship. So how we've tried to deal with this, and we get sometimes criticized because as umbrella organizations, we're constantly in this space of brokerage. trying to leverage, trying to broker. And at the risk of being criticized to be kind of working with the enemy or getting closer to government, nevertheless, if there isn't that enabling environment, we get shut down. And so to enable our left members, to continue to say what they need to say, they need to be, and we know of governments in our region that have been drafting and crafting regulations. And so what we found the need to do is come through with some self-regulating mechanism. But I think one of those other challenges is how do we triangulate that so that we're not just measuring our own performance, and we're looking at some innovative ways of doing that. And I think earlier today, in one of the sessions, there was reference to peer reviews. Mm-hmm. But perhaps this is what we can do across the Commonwealth, is to exchange that information and maybe have a hub. But then I think there's also a need to link, because there are many initiatives, but I think they all speak to the same challenges, and how do we share knowledge and experiences.
Okay, thank you. There's one challenge that has come out very clearly: the need to make sure that accountability is people-centered. And I'd like you to speak to that briefly before we open it up for all of us to participate in the discussion. How do we get that to happen? I mean, it's easy to say, we all see it, that's what needs to be done. But for the multilateral, how does AFDB ensure that the people's voice is key to the decisions that they are making? How do NGOs ensure that this happens? How does civil society ensure that this happens? So what are some of the concrete suggestions that you can make? You can make one, and then we would just, so that we have space for discussion. Just one is fine.
I know we are short of time, but I'm going to make just one point before the recommendation. And that's actually because I think in these forums, there is very quickly a kind of dichotomy that appears between people and donors. And I think we should all, because I was in AFTB, I am now in MOPAN. I think we still need to remember that the accountability to donors is also accountability to people. Because donors are accountable to their citizens and their taxpayers, and that's what triggers that accountability line. It's not out of pure kind of political interest. At the end of the day, there is also a line of accountability that goes to people on the other side.
So perhaps the question will be, which people?
Exactly, and I think, I'll go to the recommendation if I look at the African Development Bank, but I'll come back to my initial point, which is, if the interests of people are not aligned, then it will go in different direction. I think that's where there is a very important role for civil society. If you look inside the organizations, well, you have, I'll mention one very concrete thing that may make some difference, is in the world of evaluation that is somehow triggering some thinking inside the institutions. There is a lot of thinking about equity-focused evaluation, gender-focused evaluation that actually would take into account, and actually it's about implementing this no one left behind of the SDGs. How can you measure that? And I think that thinking process, if it gets implemented within the institutions, can make a difference.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just to the point of, donors' money are taxpayers' money. Mm-hmm. So that kind of alignment between the agenda of people, the givers and their recipients, is quite important. Which means that donors should be allowing the platforms for their taxpayers to hold them accountable to the extent to which they disconnect the money they collect and give from their political directions. And on the other side, you have the recipients, the affected, the citizens of the world. They have every right to set their priorities. We over-assess the needs, and we run our separate and parallel needs assessment. I remember talking to a refugee, not a refugee actually, an internally displaced person in Libya during the chaos in Libya. And I said, we're here to assess your needs. And he said, my needs were assessed 17 times in the past 3 months by 17 different players. Those include my government or governments, different international banks, NGOs, and the Libyans who are coming back wanting to help the Libyans. So I think the best place to assess the needs are civil society or representatives of civil society, and we should find ourselves, hopefully in the soon future, in a place where we trust what we get from them, not question them and try to prove them wrong, so we push them aside and say we know what's better. So that kind of better coordination, better use of resources is extremely critical when it comes to needs assessment. One last very quick story that I carry with me everywhere I go. I was with one of the most influential, or some of the most influential European countries' foreign minister in a visit to refugees in informal camps in Lebanon. And he wanted to meet with people and have a chat. He stood outside a semi-tent where a woman was preparing her cup of tea. And he looked at her and greeted her, introduced himself, and he said, "What do you need?" She stood up and she said, "What do you need?" I'll never forget that look. She said, and he said, "Excuse me?" She said, "What do you need?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "If you see me, not just as the refugee, but as your equal fellow human being, you won't ask that question because I need everything you need." So just getting back into being human in how we conduct needs assessments and not to kill people by the so many times we assess their needs and never respond to them.
Okay, thank you. And we've won ourselves the right, the recognition of being development actors in our own right. We're not an adage to government, we're not a conduit for donor. But I think there's a challenge. What development are we talking about? Because, some of us have been doing a lot of rethinking, and we've come up with a conclusion that this word development is a product of neoliberal capitalism. And that many of us have become hooked into projectization. Everything is a project. People are a project. Find a community. Do this, do that. So we've been doing things to people, at people. So I think we need to rethink. And our organization have been on this journey, and maybe accountability is a journey, not a destination. We've been on this journey of rethinking development, reshaping the Pacific we want. The Pacific we want is not going to come from Washington. It's not going to come from New York. It's not going to come from London. And secondly, you can't change people. People change themselves. And so maybe we've gotten lost in people taking ownership of their own development. We've gone and done things to people. And we've moved people around, we've shaped them around, we've written reports because we need money, 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 which is why we're questioning what development is about. So I think it's got to be development as if people matter.
Thank you. I will now open it up for discussion. We have an app, and you can type in your questions, right? I think the Glissa app is glsr.it / I've seen it in a number of /CW people, and okay, that's it. And you can ask your questions there, and it would come up. And this thing, the battery is low, so but then we'll also take questions from the floor. So I'll take 5. So 1, 2, 3. Let me come to this side. 4, 5, and then if we have time, we'll take another round.
Thank you very much. My name is Libam, and I'm from Zimbabwe. Maybe picking up from the last point that was raised around how do we ensure that the ordinary person can hold civil society accountable, especially in fragile states and fragile economies, where the service provided by the international NGO or by the local civil society, people tend to be more grateful to it. So how do we make sure that we can balance it up in a way that empowers the local person to be able to say, I do not want this. I would rather have that. I'm reminded of a story where I was working in a community where an international NGO came in, and it was a children's organization, and that community had a challenge with water, and but the solution was to drill boreholes, okay? So they did drill a lot of boreholes, but the aftermath of it was that a number of children are no longer going to school because they were now going right up to the boreholes to pump water for the animals, for the keki, for the goats, for them to drink from the boreholes. And yet, part of the organization's mandate was to increase attendance by children to school. So when they then called a community meeting and said, there was a challenge of water, and we thought this was, so what should we have done? A small boy said, I think you guys should have just dug a dam where the animals would have gone to drink water on their own, and I would have continued going to school. But you see, it was a small boy, and part of the adults' reaction was, please shut up, these guys will go. So for me, how do we create that level of accountability where communities will be able to really hold civil society accountable without the fear of missing out on the service that's being provided? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next person.
Thank you. My name is Ken Bluestone. I'm here representing Common Age and Age International, and I want to pick up this question of voice, touch on the points of the gaps and people-centered that were mentioned. And for me, the starting point has to be, what is our understanding of civil society? What do we mean by civil society? And in this, I think the Commonwealth has been totally failing its citizens. Throughout its entire history, the Commonwealth heads of government meetings have never once referred to older people in its communiques. Not once. This despite the activism and the engagement, the citizen engagement the older people have been doing. We heard about it earlier today in this very room. So we've been requested to offer calls to action. I'm going to give you a call to action as well as a very brief question. So the call to action is, we call on the Commonwealth to recognize the agency of older people as equal members of society who contribute to achieving accountability and bettering lives throughout the Commonwealth. My question is, how can the Commonwealth increase the participation of older people in building its holding its institutions to account?
Okay, thank you. Zed.
Thank you. It's Ollie Henman from Action for Sustainable Development. I wanted to pick up on a number of the panel talk about the need for this more horizontal accountability, and I think it's absolutely crucial that we move away from that sense, as you highlight, of certain top-down approaches and ensuring that things are much more shared in terms of accountability, in terms of processes, and that idea of which are the people that we're accountable to. And I wondered whether there are technologies now that are out there that allow us to do that much more horizontal approach, and this notion of disintermediation, as it's sometimes called, of not needing the big NGOs necessarily to provide that funnel for resources, but actually to allow resources to go direct to the small community organizations you're talking about. And the accountability can be built in through individuals who are the beneficiaries, uploading things through an app or a video to show the impact of that project. So we may not need those heavy log frame structures anymore if we can use the technology. And I wondered if you had some examples of that.
Okay, and then 2 questions from here. Yeah.
Thanks. Gabrielle Hussein from Trinidad and Tobago. This has been a really interesting discussion. Thank you. One of my questions is around how to hold states accountable, and I want to ask about what's the relevance of things like gender-responsive budgeting tools. Gender-responsive budgeting tools allow us to connect what is happening in households around cost of food, cost of care of aging, of elderly, cost of care of children, etc. The costs that matter most to people, to connect those to the failure of states and fiscal policy to advance gender justice. So my question is, what are the strategies and tools that we can put forward as part of a call in the Commonwealth for holding fiscal policy accountable for advancing gender justice? How can those tools use a gender-responsive budgeting approach such that they connect to what already matters in households? You don't need to convince people about why this stuff is important. You need to show them that they have the capacity to take that what is already important to them has power to hold governments accountable. So my question is around that. And then around regional banks and so on. So in the Caribbean, one of the dilemmas around, say, fossil economies like Trinidad and Tobago and so on is that the environment and post-GDP analyses and so on are really not factored in to notions of development. So our notions of development remain GDP-centered and do not cost or value the ecology and its loss. How can we transform the bases on which we are evaluating what counts as development, such that in particular the ecology and its value and cost is part of it, and in particular we move away from GDP?
Okay, thank you. Last question. And then I'll look up.
Yes, my name is Hazel Brown and I come from Trinidad and Tobago. And I just want to share, to support the idea of a Commonwealth-wide code of ethics for NGOs. We in fact have been working on that in the region for a little while on the basis of consultation with civil society organizations throughout the region. And we've been asking our CPDC member organization to sign on to the code of ethics. And we found that it's been useful in allowing people to think about how they could be accountable, just not to the donors, but also to their membership. But I'd also like to put on the table a concept that is around called open government partnership, for which some of our governments have signed on, making a commitment that in their government processes and the supply of public services, for example, that they would be willing to consult with civil society organizations before those decisions are made or implemented. And we think that we'd like to encourage people to check out open government partnership as a methodology for sustained accountability on the part of both government and civil society organizations.
Okay, thank you. There are a few other questions now. You can take any of the questions, and some of them we can take together, and particularly those that relate to specific constituencies within civil society. We have a question on where does accountability come into the fact that LGBT citizens face jail, violence, and economic exclusion within the Commonwealth. Talking about exclusion, looking at specific constituencies, and we also talked about the aged as well, older people. There's another question here about developments linked to it's saying we speak of finding alternatives to the project-centered approach in development. Can we give an example of an alternative approach? So that's also another question. What do you make of Commonwealth's response to the Oxfam scandal? So that's also another that would have to respond to. And then there's a question about how can we make sure the changes we make to the role of NGOs don't discourage investment and aid in certain areas. So looking at the agenda and whether we will not be shifting it away from certain areas that it's needed. Who is accountable to who? Especially in the light of the fact that local communities do not have the voice to really influence development interventions. I think that's linked to the question that was raised here. Yeah, so these are some of the, I can't read all of them, but because of our time. So please respond to them, any of them that you can.
I would like to start.
Well, I go first. The first question and the one on voice. I think this is the important contribution that civil society, NGOs, INGOs, and those of us who come from outside those communities. I mean, the first question one should always ask is, can that community respond to their own needs? But usually it's the one of voice is the one where their voice is not heard, outside that community. So I think that's needed, but then the challenge is, how do you do that in a way that they don't become dependent on you, or you do not replicate that sort of relationship where you're the good brother, the good sister from the outside. So I think it comes back to what is our model of development. And I think many of us, particularly our NGOs, if I can say, there's a model that happens somewhere outside that country, outside that village, and we come and replicate it. So it is part of that problem. So I think you've got to do both. I think you need to be able to find ways of working with communities and represent them, create spaces so that they can have their voices heard. On the older people, you know, I come from a region where we look to older people as wisdom holders, you know, so we don't necessarily have a society where the older people are outside that. But I think it's also correct that there needs to be this balance. So, and I've heard this word earlier, but we're also looking at this intergenerational relationship. But I do take your point that I think in terms of resourcing, those resources aren't usually there. Technology, yes, I think we've got to be more innovative. I'm a baby boomer. I was born in the 60s. I still have issues with technology, unlike my grandchildren and my children. And then in parts of the world, like in ours, where, you know, we don't have internet access, broadband, that's challenging. But it's amazing, though, the penetration of mobile phones and others is such that I think it comes back to citizen participation. I think the traditional model of NGOs and civil society is being challenged. And I think internet and technology has made the difference. People can just connect and get their views heard. So I do agree that we need to look at those innovative ways. In terms of fiscal policies, you know, gender-based budgeting has been something that the Commonwealth has been pushing in our region, for an example, but it just doesn't have traction, and I'm not sure what the issue is. Excuse me. But I think it's because those who are expected to, those who are trained to use that tool are usually the ones who are not well-resourced as well. And I think there is a kind of gender-based budgeting is seen as something that you do there, but that does not translate necessarily in terms of budget allocation. And I think the power structures still exist. Similar to accountability, I think we've all learned how to use these words, but power structures, and I think we come back to this, the power structures don't change. And if we're not careful, we perpetuate those power structures, except we look differently, we look like one of them, and we're in those communities. In terms of GDP, I'd like to say that in the Pacific, there has been work done, in particular one of the countries in the Pacific, Vanuatu. They've come up with a wellness indicator, and in fact, I think a few years ago, Vanuatu was declared the happiest country in the world, except in the UN, it's still a less development country. So clearly there's tension, and there's been some work we are aware of. But I think this is also the area that we in civil society, that's why I'm talking about this triangulation. It's not an either or. I think we still need to speak the language that governments usually measure us with and donors. But I think we need to keep pushing back, or we need to push into the more creative ways of accountability. Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, I'm not going to pick any particular question because I think all those questions are pretty much connected in a sense. And I'll start with the Oxfam one. I'm in no position to comment on what happened within Oxfam. And just a reminder for all of us, I work side by side with Oxfam colleagues in so many different places around the world, and there are amazing people. And, you know, for one person or a couple of people who did not do well, we can't trash the entire organization. Neither the sector, nor start questioning whether, you know, NGOs have done or can do good in places where they're needed. So we need to be rational here. This is a beautiful result of a Me Too movement, where the environment for all of us to accept the truth and be vocal about what went wrong is really, it's amazing. And, you know, MPs were questioned, misconduct in cabinets, misconduct in religious institutes, everywhere. It does not necessarily mean that the whole sector or the whole institute need to be just trashed and sort of punished. In terms of the use of technology, I absolutely agree that, you know, what we refer to as local and what we refer to as south and north will diminish in absolute no time, because technology, social media, it's just challenging the boundaries. The speed with which ideologies, ideas, movements are coming together from all around the globe to become local online is fascinating. And I think until we have a protected space where the giver, the taxpayer in London, can question the performance of his or her government in Vanuatu or anywhere else, we won't be able to move forward. So the whole notion of accountability and boundaries and South and North is going to be redefined, or is being actually redefined as we speak. So let's prepare for a new world that exists online, really, and does not really exist on a map as we're used to. When it comes to the elderly, and that's where I fear technology, is that they may not be able to join that conversation. So as much as I would encourage the use of innovative approaches and technology, we need to keep those spaces where the old and the young can meet together and be reminded of what good old days looked like, and how much of those values can be carried. Values do not disappear. Values do not get redefined by generations. There are those beautiful values, a sense of pride, collectiveness, that is carried in the hearts and the minds and the memories of the elderly. And it would be great if we can continue to facilitate that kind of interaction between the young and the old, because without the old, the young will lose sense of direction, particularly morally. I'm not from the Commonwealth, so I'm not in no position to advise what the Commonwealth can or cannot do, but rethink of what you really, really have in common. Because you took the Commonwealth for granted for too long, that I'm not sure if you bring a bunch of you into a room and ask you what do you have in common, other than some painful history that you're trying to get over, would you be able to define those? So you may want to go to the basics and redefine what's common between the Commonwealth countries. That may help.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, very briefly, I think I will just take comment on 2 points. The technology, and I think I will just follow on what Saba just said. I think it's very powerful, but it's not a panacea. So at the same time, we have to be cautious how to use technology, because technology can itself be excluding some people. So I think it's extremely powerful, and I know of experiences especially, I'm not sure whether the African Development Bank did that, but I know the World Bank kind of deployed this type of communication with direct beneficiaries to get their feedback on impacts and things like that, and it works well. But we have to make sure, we have to know who we are talking about, and that's a difficult thing with in the online world. The second point is, well, you mentioned regional development banks, but or regional banks, but I think it's a more general point, which is what development, and we made that point several times. Well, I think development institutions form part of a broad system that is not necessarily, from what I lived, the space of innovation and pushing boundaries in a way. So you were talking about evaluating. When I was working in evaluation, actually, when you work in evaluation, you evaluate based on what the institution is supposed to achieve, but you don't question the raison d'être of the institution as such. So in a way that system works. I don't think it will fundamentally shift the paradigm, but at the same time it is delivering. So I don't think there is a question about like throwing these institutions because of not following the right model. I think for me the real question in that space is who can push that thinking. My personal experience and my personal view is that if you look at development, no country has developed if it hasn't come from inside. It has never come from outside. The problem of our country, well, I'm not from a Commonwealth either, but I'm from Tunisia. The problem of many of the countries, I take the example of Tunisia. We went through a revolution and things are changing. But living in a kind of 20 years of dictatorship, the main consequence of that, it's not about freedom, it's stopping intellectual activity within. So you have societies who are actually not capable anymore of reinventing themselves. And that's where that transformation process starts. It will never come from an evaluation shop in the African Development Bank questioning whether the African Development Bank is doing the right thing.
Thank you. On that note, let me ask for 3 recommendations. I will take 2 from here. Actually, let's make it 4. 2 from the panel and 2 from the floor. Key recommendations that we are taking, calls to action to ourselves, because we are civil society, and also to the multilaterals. So NGOs, civil society, and the multilaterals and bilaterals. So 2 key recommendations. Let's take it from the floor first, and then I'll end with the panel. 2 key. From the back, yes, 1. I wanted to take 1 from each side. 1 from this side. Is there 1 here? Okay, so then, yes. Okay, so 2 key recommendations going forward.
Thank you. I am Tsepo in the southern part of Africa, representing SAYE, Southern African Alliance for Youth Employment. I think my recommendation would be within the Commonwealth, there should be an independent complaint desk. I thank you.
Thank you. Short and sweet. Yes.
All right, my name is Kennedy. I'm a Nigerian living in Preston, Lancashire. My recommendation would be in terms of entrepreneurship. If we could access our foreign development partners to Africa to actually allow Africa to decide what needs developing. Now, because a lot of youth are pushed into some areas of entrepreneurship that is actually not useful to them, especially when the architecture is not available. So if they could get in touch with the African people, and we can tell them exactly how we need to develop, because we have been underdeveloped by these developmental partners. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I come to the panel?
Yes, I'd like to recommend that Commonwealth governments develop a policy framework for recognizing the role of civil society and strengthening and resourcing an enabling environment for civil society effectiveness.
Thank you. Any other recommendation?
I'm not sure if I can, but I mean, my only recommendation is to go back to the basics and not to assume that we all agree on definitions of big, fashionable words. My genuine recommendation would be to contextualize the concept of accountability so it is reflective of what people define as right and wrong at their local level. Ensure channels to communicate such accountabilities with independent bodies. And make sure that when we do wrong, we admit it. We just be humble. Say that we're not perfect. And take yourself to task before you're being taken to task.
Thank you very much. There's one thing I would take away from here. It would be the need for us to look within to solve our problems.
Absolutely.
I think everything we talked about came back to that, because that's where people can then hold you accountable, because they own what it is, that whatever it is that we've come up with. I want to thank you for a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Nana and the panel for a very thought-provoking discussion. Hello. Nana mentioned the Glisser app we've been using for polling in the forum. And we have just one multiple choice question for you coming out of this discussion. So if you haven't already done so, please log on to the website glisser.it/Commonwealth people. And it should bring up this session, Accountability in Development. If it doesn't, just click on Select Your Session or the 3 bars on the left of the screen and scroll down to Accountability in Development, where you should find this question. So in your view, which of these stakeholders do you want more accountability from? And there you see all the choices. So everybody's inputting, as you can see. At the moment, government is well up there, together with the NGOs. Okay, and we have coming in multilaterals, business. Is that business or NGOs? I think it's NGOs. Great. Any more? Nope. Yep. Okay. Right. It's still governments. You want more accountability for governments. but quite a lot from all the others as well. So thank you very much for giving us your thoughts on that. And please now join us for lunch in the Cambridge and back in the Mountbatten at 2:30 for the closing address, which will include the wonderful poets we saw at the start and also details of the call to action coming out of the forum. Thank you very much. Thank you again.